It lets you order a taxi, get a pizza to your door perhaps, but what about your next job? Uber's launching an app to connect workers with companies that are hiring. How are job apps changing the world of work? Welcome to Roundtable. Hello from me, David Foster. Now, if you can afford it, that is, life appears to be getting more and more convenient all of the time. Taxis on demand, movies the same, food deliveries likewise. So if a company needs a worker, well, yes, there are apps for that as well.
Finding work doesn't need to be as laborious as it used to be with long job applications. Uber has launched an app called Uber Works, linking gig economy workers to jobs and shift work. The launch is another way companies like Uber are diversifying their business from getting a ride to getting a job, and at the same time increasing its profitability. But Uber isn't the only one providing this service in the marketplace. Other apps like TaskRabbit and Upwork also link freelance workers with jobs. In the UK, gig economy has more than doubled over the past 3 years and accounts for 4.7 million workers. Supporters argue that the gig economy gives individuals flexibility and economic adaptation to different work. Critics argue that workers get exploited. As precarious work continues to grow along with the use of these apps, what are the consequences for workers?
I'm very pleased to say that joining me at the round table today we have Guy Michaels, Associate Professor at the London School of Economics. We have Julia Besser, Academic Fellow at the University of Leeds, researching precarious work. Steve Gerlich joins us, GMB, that's the Union GMB Regional Organiser, working on also precarious employment. And from the United States, we say hello to Alexandria Ravenel, author of Hustle and Gig, a book about the gig economy. Anybody's allowed to say anything they want at any time, but I'm going to go to Alexandria first, partly because of your book, which has a subtitle, and you'll tell us that. But I saw a headline that said, why these ideas of the apps are great for business, but not for gig economy workers. And it seems to me that it's actually win-win, isn't it, for both the workers and the businesses?
So that's a good question to start off with. The subtitle of my book is Struggling and Surviving in the Sharing Economy. And that really sums up the situation of gig workers. You know, many of them are very vulnerable. They are exploited. They run incredible risks along the lines of sexual harassment, physical injury. They run the risk of financial disaster because they can be deactivated even if they've invested thousands of dollars, like Uber drivers, in starting to drive for Uber. So the idea that it's beneficial for the employers and for the workers is kind of a myth. It's
well,
really
no, hang on. I get that there are problems, but without the gig economy, without these apps that help them find work, they wouldn't have work. They'd rely on a postcard in a post office window or a small ad in the back of a newspaper, and they don't exist anymore. So they wouldn't have work.
For a small portion of workers in the gig economy, yes, this is an occupation of last resort that they are turning to. However, they still end up being incredibly vulnerable as a result. And in fact, workers that are turning to gig work as an occupation of last resort are actually more vulnerable, in my research, to sexual harassment and finding themselves in really questionable situations.
So do these apps, and any one of you can jump in on this one, do these apps make things better or worse? Julie, you want to start?
First of all, there is technology where they can actually create networks. Workers can create networks within each other and send different jobs, so they can actually find jobs between themselves.
So effectively that's word of mouth, but it's not the same as being able to click on that and say, oh, look, the dog and duck down the road needs somebody to wash their dishes tonight. That's going to be worth 50 quid to me. I could do with that.
That's true. However, part of this £50, for example, or $50, someone else is taking, part of a proportion of this. Whereas if they're working alone, first of all, they can create networks that can help them to find different jobs as well, so more jobs. And they can take all the amount of money for themselves without having to pay a fee, or, for example, having to pay a fee if they do not go to the work, or if they do not appear, or if they do not find a substitute.
Well, we'll talk about that in just a moment. But I understand what you're saying. But let's say you get 4 shifts at the Dog and Duck, because it's easy to get the work and you have to lose a bit of the money because the employer takes some of it or the app takes some of it. But if you were doing it through this wonderful network of friends and, I've heard about this, I've heard about that, you might only get 1. So the pluses can outweigh the minuses. Guy or Steve?
I think that's somewhat simplistic in terms of the interpretation. Most people actually like some clarity in what they're going to do from an occupational perspective. Most individuals don't like change, and they like to know where they stand from a financial perspective, especially if they have bills to pay.
That's if they're allowed the luxury of it, because sometimes people desperately need work, they desperately need money.
But at
what
what
say they
cost?
like that, of course they would.
No, but at what cost? And there are various stratas of gig economy. You have apps such as Fiverr, as an example, where you might find somebody who is a designer, has some spare time, and therefore is happy to embark on a project on behalf of somebody for an agreed fee or similar. But then when you start to look at some of the apps, the question is, what is behind them? How far do they go in terms of the moral stance they take with regard to the companies they take, and what background checks do they take in relation to the companies who are putting themselves forwards, offering work? What protections are there for the individuals? We're talking about some very unscrupulous companies out there. I was with a company this morning where I spoke to couriers who are ostensibly providing their own vehicle. They are covering the fuel and the cost. They have worries. In London at the moment, they're worried because the vehicles they have don't actually match environmental standards. How do they afford to replace them?
That's their problem, isn't it?
No, because if you
if I come into the congestion zone area and my car's of the wrong engine size or it's kicking out diesel fumes, that's my problem, I have to pay a fine. Surely if you're taking an inadequate vehicle to work, that's your problem.
Well, certainly that's, again, quite a simplistic view of it, because when it comes down to those individuals, can they get the finance for another vehicle? Can they even find the other vehicle? Is there availability? Is the cost going to be prohibitive for return on investment? Can they, if they've already taken a vehicle and legislation has changed and they're committed into a lease or a finance package, make that change? They don't have that. Then you've got to ask, is the company who are providing these low rates per parcel going to make it up to them in terms of the expense for asking them to deliver on their behalf?
Let's talk about how big the gig economy is now, Guy. This is something that you've looked into. What is it? It's about 10%. Is that going up day by day?
Well, yes. I mean, there are different estimates, different definitions of what the gig economy is, right? And I think the latest Office for National Statistics figures that I saw were more in the range of 5%. There are more recent numbers from one of the trade unions saying it's close to 10% and rising. But it depends a bit.
If it's 5%, is it going down?
No, it's probably going up. It's likely that it's going up. Again, it depends a bit on the definition and depends on what you include in the gig economy. It depends on how much time are people spending, is it like the main job or secondary job and so on. So it depends a bit on the definition.
And can we assume that the gig economy encapsulates 0 hours contracts? Are they one and the same?
No, they're not the same, and there are differences, and there are different contracts, and some of them involve a variety of different contracts. And I think the gentleman from the GMB talked about that, and I think yes, there are very different contracts. Some of them involve 0 hour contracts, some of them don't. I think the scope of the 0 hour contracts in the UK is somewhat lower.
What we're going to try and do is discuss the gig economy in this programme. And any one of you can say anything at any time. And we're going to try and reach some kind of consensus on whether these apps make it better or worse or don't affect it at all. But we have to discuss the nature of the gig economy first. Alexandria, you put gig workers into 3 categories: strugglers, strivers, and successes.
Yes, success stories. Yes. So, depending on how much capital you come in with, educational background, uh, the gig economy can be a very different experience for you. So, for workers who come in with high levels of skill and capital and who can make large investments in creating an Airbnb hotel, then they are going to have large returns on their investment. I've spoken to workers who are corporate attorneys and who are able to make an additional $70,000, $80,000 a year from their Airbnb work. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have what I call the strugglers. And these are the people who are turning to gig work out of a moment of desperation. And they very much are vulnerable to different things that are going on in the market. They're more likely to find themselves accidentally involved in criminally questionable behavior and to find themselves in situations where they're putting themselves at physical risk. And then the middle are the strivers. And these are the people who are turning to this as a side hustle or as an additional source of income to help with stagnant salaries and growing debt.
Okay. I know you wanted to say something, Yulia, but I'll throw this one out there. 'Twas ever thus, wasn't it? You get your strugglers in life, you get those who try to do something, the strivers, and you get your success stories, whether they do it through their own ability or because they've got capital behind them.
No. I'll let you speak first.
No, I just want to say that that does not mean, though, that we have to generate this and actually augment it. So we should not necessarily, I mean, we don't have to create an economy which is based on this kind of categorization and do whatever we can in order to increase it and make it more and more and more precarious.
So, but you just want to feather bed it for people so that life's easy.
I don't think that life is easy for people, no. And I feel that, on the contrary, life is becoming more difficult for people who are actually who have a stable income. And what I just want to explain with gig economy is that the people who are being called strivers or strugglers who are finding difficulties in creating an income, gig economy does not necessarily help them, neither for the time being, because this is a very a topical phenomenon that may disappear or may explode like a bubble. And on the other hand, it doesn't help them at all for their future.
I've heard these arguments time and time and time again. So perhaps better regulation is what we need. And we'll get on to that in just a moment. Steve, I know you're desperate to say something, but I was looking at Guy, and he wanted to say something in relation to what you did.
I wanted to say something about, inequality has risen in most countries, including this country and the US and, most developed economies. So, this distinction is important about people with different levels of income, and inequality has gotten worse.
Well, let's take it out of this country and put it into a less developed continent, Africa, parts of Asia, something like this, which would give people work where they wouldn't necessarily have access to it, where it would give them some kind of income and it's easier to find. That's good, isn't it?
Well, I think it's a mixed blessing. I think there are good things about the gig economy. It's not a completely bad story. I think in terms of certainly consumers benefit, as you said in the beginning, and I also think there's probably, as a result of this kind of additional flexibility of the labor market, there's probably higher levels of employment and less unemployment than in places where the labor market is more rigid. At the same time, I completely agree with what colleagues around the tables have said, that this is there are serious costs involved in this. So one thing is that these companies, because these workers are labeled as kind of independent contractors, they don't pay their full share of taxes. I think that is an issue, and these workers don't get the kind of rights and protections that kind of workers have fought for many decades and kind of earned them. So I think in that respect, this is a problem, a situation of very asymmetric power often, and I think this is problematic.
You didn't. You said, sort of nodded at me negatively when I suggested regulation was what was needed. But I'm going to throw at you what's happening in California come the beginning of next year, January the 1st. New rules about Uber,
Absolutely,
which guarantee rights. Is that the way to go?
Well, legislation is part of it, but efficacy of individuals is the other part of it. And if you're going to set up a company and you're going to say, right, I'm going to send you out to deliver this glass to somebody's house for £1, and then you think, a few weeks later, I'm more concerned about the consumer. I'm going to pay you 80 pence or 80 cents or whatever it is, wherever you are in the world, and I'm going to choose to reduce that rate without any discussion with you. Is that a fair contract?
And do these apps make that more likely?
That happens consistently now. That's why we are where we are. That's why places like California, New Jersey are starting to move that way. Obviously, we've got a case. We're back at Supreme Court for Uber mid-year next year. And we're hoping that
But do you think these apps make it more likely? Alexandra, I saw you nodding at some point that Stephen made. I don't know whether it was that one.
Yes, it is. So these apps are notorious for not being transparent about how workers are getting paid. Here in the US, we actually had Instacart, which is a grocery delivery service that was keeping the tips that were being given to the delivery workers and using them to underwrite their own labor costs. So if someone was supposed to receive a $10 tip, the company would use that, put it in their own pocket, and then only pay the worker a small portion.
So bring in laws like the Uber law in California.
So the Uber law in California, AB5, which Uber has actually said does not apply to them, and they promised to fight, would take into account whether or not the work is integral to the company's services, in which case it's hard to imagine Uber without the drivers. How else does a transportation company work right now if they don't have any?
I just want to quote something from Uber's work platform. This is in a magazine called TechCrunch. And I'll abbreviate it. Uber suggesting its, quote, technology-first approach will lead to a, quote, more efficient marketplace by providing a reliable pool of vetted and qualified workers. The magazine then says, isn't that code for workers who slack off being seen by the technology to be slacking and therefore likely to get great shifts in the future? You could argue that that's brilliant. People who don't work hard, who are seen not to be working hard, are not necessarily going to be at the front of the queue.
So that creates a disparity anyway that can't be controlled. But I just want to circle back to something you'd mentioned earlier when you talked about other places. You talked about Africa. You talked about other marketplaces. Unfortunately, law and legislation isn't as developed in those marketplaces. So you have every feasible reason to believe that people will be taken advantage of. When you're in a marketplace where people are paid pennies to check pictures to see whether a traffic light is green or red or whether an obstacle exists for another app, let's say, that's tried to move towards autonomous driving, there is an opportunity cost. When there is no control over that, when you do have haves and have-nots, you do have a problem. If you live in one part of the world and you're in a major city, you might find that you can earn a good level of income. That doesn't mean you'll slack. It just means that sometimes you'll have to work longer.
But let's go back to this, because there are two ways of reading it, aren't there? One is that Uber is spying on people through this work app, and if they don't check in at a certain time, they get put to the back of the queue. The other one is that by checking that they're working hard or not clocking in at the right time, Uber's sifting the better workers from the worse workers.
But I think that by definition, in a certain sense, looking at how much people are working, seeing what they're doing, and all this kind of panopticon is, in a sense, is on top of employees to look how much they're working, how much they're not working.
Good thing if you're paying them, isn't it?
I don't know, because I don't know who would like to have a phantom on top of their heads looking at whether they work a lot or they don't work a lot. And I don't think that the problem is necessarily looking at who is working more and who is working less, but the problem is when you're starting categorizing workers into that aspect.
A more efficient marketplace providing a reliable pool, in other words, getting rid of the unreliable, of vetted and qualified workers. Vetted, we're watching you, we're checking that you're all the right people for the job. Makes economic sense, doesn't it, Guy?
Well, I think it is problematic. I think this is a situation where, in a normal employment relationship, usually the employer has quite a lot of power. I think the concern is that, with these kind of apps where there's more of an arm's length relationship and the employer doesn't know the person in question, and they're less likely to develop some kind of, long-term
Hard to put
relationship with it.
It's hard to put your reasons for not being
Right.
able to do the job out there. I get
Well,
that.
it's
And by
not
the way, I
just-
get an awful lot of what you're saying. I'm just being slightly provocative on purpose.
Yeah, but what I would say is you talked about the likes of Uber being arbiters of what is right and what is wrong. To be honest with you, they haven't done a great job of it so far. Otherwise,
Yeah,
we wouldn't be
that's what I
looking
wanted
at
to say.
recording individuals in cars, talking about fingerprint checks and things like this. Certainly, they're one of the last organisations I'd be thinking about of saying, you know what, you understand how business works and you understand people's business models.
Yeah, actually, the Uber app, as far as I understand it, isn't actually doing that well financially
And
anyway.
essentially-
I'll come to you in a minute, Alexandra, but Guy, yeah.
Just one more thing. I think, in an employment relationship, there is some surplus that's being generated, right? There is some value that's being generated because the employer brings certain know-how, technology, capital, and the worker brings their effort, and know-how. And there is some surplus that's being generated. So I think part of the worry is if you have a situation where you have more control, that it's not just about how much surplus is being generated, but it's also about who gets to keep the surplus, and whether if there's extreme monitoring, so one side really knows exactly what the other side is doing, the worker doesn't know what the employer is up to, then this creates a problem.
Can this be stopped? And Julia, I will come back to you. I promised Alexandra I'd go to her first of all. Companies taking advantage is another thing that you say. So how do you stop that happening?
Oh, that is a good question. I mean, here in the US, because most gig workers are independent contractors, what we should do is not let the companies decide they're going to be independent contractors, but require them to classify these workers as employees. Laws in the US are very much influenced, at least early on, by the UK. And we allow companies to determine if workers are going to be independent contractors, and they can take advantage of this. And so the inefficiencies are really for the workers, because companies don't have to pay until the worker is physically giving a ride or physically giving a task. And so all the inefficiencies are really borne by the worker
But they
who
can't,
runs the risk.
They cannot all be the same. There must be some good ones, some bad ones. We will not identify them in the course of this programme, but I wondered if you can tell whether somebody's
It is
putting out an honest app or not. Tell me about, we've got so many here. Bacon, Catapult, Gig, Job Today, Limber, Rota, Shift Gig, Shifty, Snag, Sift, and that's just a few.
Maybe it's the evolution of the apps. Maybe it's the next step. Maybe this is what needs to actually happen. Maybe, for example, and this is something that we are currently working on, we're trying to see how these independent workers are protesting, how they're demonstrating, how they're trying to voice these kind of challenges they're facing. And I totally agree with you. I want also to build on what you were saying before, that this kind of demonstrations and this kind of voicing is taking place mainly in the UK and in the US, where there is the ground for this kind of voices, but it's not happening in countries such as Africa or Asia. So I do believe that the next step may be more fair app.
Should you intrinsically distrust these apps, or should you just distrust the type of person who's putting their work out there on it until you can prove them good or bad? It's not the apps themselves necessarily, is it?
Well, this comes back to vetting. And in my perspective, if you are a company who are providing a service to individuals to get food, as an example, you can only vet the restaurant or the dark kitchen to a certain level to know whether they're going to do good or bad. But I can tell you from experience that drivers who come to collect product may wait 30, 40 minutes, which means that they're not earning during that period. They may face verbal abuse even from the individuals working within the restaurant. They face the added problem of verbal abuse if the order isn't correct. There is no firm, safe avenue for this. Whereas if you look at something like Guru as an app, that is a little bit more structured. You're looking at people who are normally being hired for programming or computer-based product.
Or this Fiverr one that you mentioned.
Fiverr.
I've seen that on the London Underground. I'm going to go to Alexandra very quickly because we've got to wrap it all up. The issues are only going to multiply, whether they are answers or problems.
Yes. So the answer is to really pay more attention to the experience of the workers. I don't think that the challenges associated with gig work are going to disappear anytime soon. Companies benefit just too much from classifying their workers this way and not giving them these generations of hard-won protections.
Okay, quick one from the economist at the table. Will we one day have 20, 30, 40% gig economy?
Well, I think I think as long as it remains fairly small and it opens kind of some way to kind of flexibly open the economy, there are benefits. I think the larger this sector becomes, the more the problems that were flagged here need to be addressed. So I think there will be more these employers will have even more power, and it will be more problematic. So I think it's good to start addressing and thinking about these various issues and trying to kind of figure out how to do this better now.
Which we have done to some extent here at this roundtable. Alexandria, thank you very much indeed. Good luck with all of your work. Thank you to the three of you at this table. Interesting, though, isn't it, to note that much of the last, 150 years since the Industrial Revolution started, now, of course, we're in the tech revolution, the fourth Industrial Revolution. Interesting that for the first 150 years, people were arguing about employees' rights. Now here we are talking about whether they're actually employees at all. That's another question for another day. Listen, thank you. Thank you very much for taking part. Thank you for watching. From me, David Foster, and the team, goodbye for now. Bye-bye.